Good afternoon. I'm David Hanson, head of the Department of English. Welcome to the Common Read for Fall of 23 with our Common Read author, Adrian Matejka. I want to thank the Common Read Committee, the Southeastern Channel, the faculty in the department, and all of the students who make the Common Read a success every semester. Our Common Read author for fall, Adrian Matejka, grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana. You can read his first book of poems, The Devil's Garden, which has a lot about his experiences there. He then attended Indiana University in Bloomington, and he earned an MFA at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Mr. Matejka has been recognized with numerous awards: the Eugene and Marilyn Glick Indiana Authors Award, the Julia Berturkin Award, and fellowships from the Academy of American Poets, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Lannan Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Rockefeller Foundation, and a Simon Fellowship from United States Artists. He served as Poet Laureate of the state of Indiana from 2018 to 2019, and he's presently the editor of Poetry Magazine in Chicago. Our Common Read is The Big Smoke, published by Penguin in 2013. It was awarded the 2014 Anisfeld Wolf Book Award, and it was a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, the National Book Award, and the Pulitzer Prize. You'll also be interested in, and Adrian will talk about, a graphic novel which is based on the life of Jack Johnson, like The Big Smoke. And you can find this in the comics and graphic novel section of Sims Library on the second floor in the serials room. So be sure to check this out. After the presentation, Adrian Matejka will be happy to sign your books. We're going to take him out to the lobby for the signing. And out there as well is where you will find sign-up sheets for your classes. During the Q&A session, Adrian's going to do a reading and a presentation about Big Smoke and about the graphic novel. And then for the Q&A session, we have two faculty members in the audience with microphones. They will come around to you so you can ask your question with the mic so that everybody here can hear it, and also the Southeastern Channel can pick it up. And so now, Adrian Matejka.
Peace, everybody. It is really good to see you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for joining me, and those who got stuck here again after this morning's session, thank you for enduring. I'm so glad to be here visiting you. It's been a really beautiful day so far, and I hope I can share something that might be useful in Jack Johnson's story, as well as the poems that were inspired by that. So I'm going to read from The Big Smoke to start out with, since I know that that's what you all were required to read. I'm glad to answer questions about it if you have assignments you're supposed to do afterward. And then I'm going to shift a little bit in the second part of my presentation and read from the graphic novel, just a little bit so you can get an idea of where this project started and where it ended, because I'm done with it now after 18 years. So it's a great relief, actually, to have finally figured out how this whole story ended for me. So I'm going to start with The Big Smoke. You can turn on the video. This is Jack Johnson. He was the first black heavyweight champion of the world. He won the title in 1908 by beating a guy named Tommy Burns, who will pop up in one of the poems I'm going to read. All the poems I'm going to read are in the voice of Jack Johnson. It's called Battle Royale. Back then, they'd chain a bear in the middle of the bear garden and let the dogs loose. Iron chains around a bear's neck don't slow him too much. A bear will always make short work of a dog. Shakespeare said Sackerson did it more than 20 times to dogs and wildcats alike. And since most creatures are naturally afraid of bears, there wouldn't always be much of a show in the bear garden. So the handlers sometimes put the bear's eyes out or took his teeth to make the fight more sporting. I believe you need eyes more than you need teeth in a fight, but losing either makes a bear a little less mean. Once baiting was against the law, some smart somebody figured coloreds would fight just as hard if hungry enough. So they rounded up the skinniest of us, had us strip to trousers, then blindfolded us before the fight. They turned us in hard circles a few times on the ring steps before pushing us between the ropes. When the bell rang, it felt like I got hit from 8 directions. I didn't know where those punches came from, but I sung so hard, my shoulder hadn't been right since, because the man said, only the last darky on his feet gets a meal. You can't really tell, but Jack Johnson had gold teeth. I want to read a poem called Prize Fighter. Jack Johnson was a huge fan of automobiles. And so this guy right here is named Barney Ohlfeld. He was the automobile champion in 1901. And Jack Johnson challenged him to a race. What you're going to see, it looks like it was a good race in the video, but Jack Johnson got smoked in it. He actually lost by like 3, like he got lapped 3 times. But in the video, it looks like he kind of kept it together. Prize Fighter. I love horses because they will outrun the fastest man. They're majestic, as stately as a Saturday woman before a party. Horses smell like what it means to be fast. Sweat and gravel kicked up on early morning runs, the in and out of breath like gravel in tired lungs. I groomed and raced horses from Texas to Philadelphia before one broke my leg with a back kick. Thanks to that break, I can't ride anymore, and even if I could, we got these automobiles now, and they can carry us a mile a minute. I'm buying the fastest one I can find once I get my money together. I'm like an automobile in the ring. My fists work like cranked up engines. I've got the kind of elasticity other fighters dream about when I put them to sleep on the canvas. When I clinch a man, it's like being swaddled in forgiveness. When I hook a man, it's like being hit by frustration. I can't tell if horses are happy or confounded by this new means of locomotion, but I could say with certainty, my prize fighting cohorts are decidedly dissatisfied by my presence. And why this is running a little bit, I wanted to mention that in 1910, there were 100,000 cars in the entire United States. It wasn't like you could go to a car dealership. You had to get one made, and it would take 6 to 8 months. There were 100,000 cars in the whole country, and Jack Johnson had 5 cars. So you can imagine that that wasn't a thing that went over very well with people who did not have the same means. I'm going to read a poem called Mouth Fighting. So we call it talking trash now, but back then they used to call it mouth fighting. And the idea was if you could get into your opponent's head, that was a way for you to get an advantage as a fighter. Muhammad Ali talked quite a bit about Jack Johnson being an inspiration for him in that capacity. Mouth fighting. Sometimes the fight is over even before we split the ropes. The fighter's glass jaw, the cut of his costume, the absence of pretty women in his entourage, all fair game for the mouth fight. Never mothers or children, never wives or crippled relatives or women at all unless they're sporting women. There's always something else to talk about. A civilized mouth fight is about making a fighter wild, and as soon as I can tell he's listening, I know I've won. Yellow fighters like Tommy Burns want to tear out when the talk starts. You can hear their knees knocking as clearly as spoons in a vaudeville show. Others lose composure, and that's when it's over. How is a fighter supposed to think about defensing while he's trying to get at me by whatever means is necessary? That's why the mouth is the most devastating weapon, and mine shines to high heaven every time I take a swing. So there's no sound in this because they didn't have sound in videos back then. But all of this is archival footage of the fight. So you get to see kind of what it looks like, and I want to just take a pause. From that angle, they look like they're the same size, but you're about to see that they are not. You see him smiling at him too, right? It's like, yeah, you can come and taste some of this. Sometimes it looks a little bit more like wrestling than boxing does, modern boxing, but he's doing it. So there's Jack Johnson, 6'2", 240. There's Tommy Burns, 5'8", 175 pounds. And this is the poem about this fight. It's called A Struggle Between a Demon and a Gritty Little Dwarf, which is is the way that the Baltimore American described this fight. The longer the fight lasts, the more the moving picture writes work. That's why I kept Ketchel off the canvas. He might have called himself the assassin, but I played with him in the ropes like a cat does a mouse, lacing him just enough to bring blood for the show. That's what a prize fighting is, a show. The better man always wins, but we all play our part in the spectacle. His handlers dressed him up for his part as a heavyweight and by using high boots and extra coats. Underneath it all, he was strictly a middleweight, and I picked him up and held him high so his feet dangled like a Sunday chicken on that special morning. Then I smiled at the only colored in the crowd, hatless, next to all those whites and their bowlers and bright ribbon fedoras. I heard Ketchel's second slap to canvas and he yelled, "Now then, Stanley," but I didn't see the double cross coming until Ketchel's hook hit me behind the ear. I dropped, stopped my fall with a glove before I hit the canvas. The referee started counting and the buzzing sound started inside my ears like a crowd before the fight. All those spectators hoping Ketchel put me down. The crowd quieted when I smiled my ghost smile and punched the dust off my gloves. Quiet enough to hear me hit Ketchel so hard we both fell down. Quiet enough to hear the 1, 2, 3 of his teeth hitting the canvas like chicken scratch. 2 of his uppers got stuck in my glove. Quiet as Ketchel sprawled out like he was counting the clouds, the referee counting them out slowly for fear of his own skin. I didn't show I was scared, but I was. I leaned casually on the top rope, waiting for a twitch, a breath, any signs to show that the man might be a man again. Yeah. So in a second, they're going to stop the thing before he falls so nobody sees it. I want to read a poem that I read this morning, so forgive me for those who heard this already, but it's a whole poem that's all, yeah, that's the poem, that's the fight I was reading a poem about just a second ago. So you'll see him get knocked out. I wanted to read a poem that I read this morning because it's all a direct quote. And so when Jack Johnson was trying to get a chance to fight for the heavyweight championship, there was a lot of animosity that was just solely based in this race. And some of you probably heard this already, but Jack Johnson's parents were enslaved. So he was the first generation after emancipation. So nobody really knew what this was supposed to look like, right? This is Jim Crow, this is Reconstruction, this is people trying to figure out how to keep black people down, and in the same circumstances they were before. And inside of that, here's just this resplendent man with gold teeth and fast cars and married to a white woman. It did not fit the template. So they would do this kind of work to make him seem less smart than he was. Like newspapers would change his language so that he seemed like he wasn't intelligent. But then you could hear him, like 'cause they had audio recordings, you could hear he was a really smart guy. And so I thought that it might be useful to have a poem that's really just all him. I didn't do anything to it but make line breaks. It's called Sporting Life. And this lifestyle around around fighting was called the sporting life. So, you know, lots of drinking, lots of late nights, gambling, that kind of stuff. Jack Johnson loved to gamble, and he was always broke because he was always buying drinks for everybody and spending his money in this carousing way. Sporting life. People are always talking about if and suppose like those words are worth more than money, more than the crease a silk stocking makes on a woman's thigh, more than the grumble of a Thomas Flyer engine, so I take the sides of my pleasures. 2 small words, if and suppose, and nobody can explain them. We get in this world what we're gonna get. After all, one man can roll out of bed and be killed while another man falls from a scaffold and lives. A man can get a bullet in the brain and keep his life while some other poor sap dies from a shot in the leg. It's all luck and perspective. Pleasure is both to me. I added one "and" to that. Everything else was just Jack Johnson. So you're gonna try to tell me that this guy isn't smart, you know? That wasn't the problem. All right. I think I want to read maybe 2 more and then switch to the graphic novel so we have time. I mentioned that he's got gold teeth, so I got to definitely read that poem. And then maybe a poem about his wife, Etta. All right. Okay. I'm going to start by, I said 2, I'm going to do 3, but they're all short, so you don't have to hold your breath. I spent 8 years working on this book, and I tried to get it as tight as I could, so everything that happens in the book actually happened. All of the events, all of the references, they're all at the right time, right place, right everything. It's essentially nonfiction, but it's written in poems. And one of the places where I almost made a huge mistake was a poem called Ticket on the Titanic that was inspired by Leadbelly's song, The Titanic. And in the song, Jack Johnson doesn't get on the Titanic, and when he finds out it sinks, he's dancing on the dock because he survived and all those other people did not, right? So that really upset him, and so this poem is about that. Ticket on the Titanic. Ed and I had no intention of missing the maiden voyage of the finest ship built by man, but Captain Smith drew the color line almost quickly as Tommy Burns did. I expect the line from a frightened prize fighter, but an English sea captain, he should be more principled, especially after I offered $4,000 for each ticket. Of course, the color line kept me from fighting for Edda's space on one of those lifeboats right when the iceberg hit. That is a fight you could bet your last copper I would have won. Even after all the offense I suffered and the indignity of being refused passage, I would have never danced the Eagle Rock after all those people drowned. He was really upset that somebody would suggest that he would celebrate the deaths of so many people. And so in the first version of this, when I wrote it, I had this idea that he was going to fight his way on this lifeboat and that he and Edda would sail off, and that was going to be that. And it happened the day I was going to send this to my editor. It was the anniversary of the Titanic somehow. And on NPR, they had this piece about the one guy who got on one of the lifeboats. And so there was plenty of room, but you don't get on the lifeboat. Like the men didn't do that. It was just elderly people and kids and women. And so the rest of the guys stayed on the boat and sang. But there was room for some of them, just not all of them. And this one guy was like, you know what, man, later, I'm getting on the lifeboat. And he did, and then every place he went, they were like, that's the guy who got on the lifeboat, and they'd run him out of town. So 2 years later, he killed himself. And I was gonna have Jack Johnson talking about fighting his way onto the lifeboat, and that would have been like, some Titanic geek would have been in the audience and would have tried to correct me. Didn't happen. All right. This is the last poem I'm gonna read, and then I'll switch to the other thing. Like I said, Jack Johnson had gold teeth. He didn't need them, he just wanted them. And the last thing in this poem is a direct quote about why he got them. It's called Gold Smile, and it has an epigraph from Shakespeare, who is Jack Johnson's favorite author. Teeth hadst thou in thy head when thou was born, to signify thou camest to bite the world. And that's from Henry VI, for those Shakespeare fans. They call teeth dent in France, and the name makes sense the way teeth do what they do to bacon and shoulders and cakes. The French word for gold is ore, so when the folks in Paris describe my smile, it sounds like what happens when I punch a door. Dent's door. Dent's door, the French children say when I open wide. Dent's door, Edda said when she locked herself in the powder room. Tommy Burns said Dent's door when I was hooking him into asking for forgiveness. His people back in Canada would have said the exact same thing if they were in Sydney to witness our spectacle. Before we got into the ring, I told Tommy, the only reason I got these gold uppers is to make every bite of my food twice as expensive. Think about that. This dude didn't need them at all. And you know, all my favorite rappers got their grills, but he had one in 1901. Feels like a trailblazer if there ever was one. All right. I think this is a good place for me to stop the video if you can do that and switch to the other thing. So the Big Smoke was the first part of this project, and when I started researching it, there was so much information and so much material. I knew it was going to be 2 books. I couldn't fit it all into 1 book of poems. I didn't want to write 2 books of poems, though, because for me, you know, poetry is about discovery and curiosity, and I'd already asked the questions and had them answered in these pages, so I didn't feel like it made a lot of sense to write another book of poems. So that's how I ended up writing a graphic novel and working with this wonderful artist, Yusef Dowdy, on this. So I'm going to turn my back to you all, which is not polite stuff on the stage, but it's because I'm going to read from this, and it's better for the sound if I have everything facing the same way. So just a couple of things you need to know about this. I'm only going to read the beginning of it, and there's a lot of language in it, a lot of really racist language that was directed toward Jack Johnson, and I'm not going to read that stuff out loud. I'm just going to read the overtext where Jack Johnson is talking about his experiences, but I'll be slow with the change so everybody can read and see what's going on. I just don't want to put that stuff out into the world anymore. We didn't want to avoid it because this is how he was treated, but at the same time, it's pretty rough, you know, the racism that he endured. So I'll just read that slowly so everybody has a chance to keep up, and then we can answer some questions after. Okay, is that okay? All right, thank you. So Yusef Dowdy, if you like jazz, check out his book, Monk, about Thelonious Monk. It's really beautiful. Men have been locked in combat since before there was money in it. They fought with their hands, they fought with rocks and sticks, they fought over pretty women, they fought over meat and who got to sit next to the fire on winter nights. Prize fighting is just a more entertaining version of those prehistoric battles, and I'm the best battler there ever was. July 4th, 1910, dawn came like a comeuppance. The old men in Reno said they'd never felt the sun so close. It was the kind of hot that makes water disappear from your glass like magic and boils sweat on the forehead. Eggs fried without a fire. One man's cigar lit on his own. That didn't stop the 20,000 spectators who came in automobiles, on horseback, and by horse-drawn wagon. Trains ran from all parts of the country every 30 minutes. When there wasn't any more room to squeeze inside, fans rode on the top of the trains. Better to tie yourself to a locomotive than miss the battle of the century. Of course, Tex Rickard picked Nevada as home for our contest. Of course, he picked Reno. Reno, where divorce is as easy to get as a shot of whiskey and just as cheap. Gamblers, sports, prostitutes, and fight fans filled the streets and came with all the cash they could carry. Almost all the bets were on Jeffries. The pickpockets and petty thieves were open for business. Tickets sold as quickly as they were printed. Only 16,000 of the unruly fans managed to get one. All of these saps betting against me. What's that saying about a fool and his money? The day got hotter every minute as the sun crested the bright desert, but the sports showed up in their gambling suits anyway. The sawmills and carpenters worked through the heat of the day and by torchlight at night to build the stadium in less than 3 weeks. The whole place smelled like dust and sweat and new pine used to make the bleachers. You could hear the hammers and saws still working as the spectators lined up, but they got it ready. I am ready. I've been ready for this since the day I left Galveston to make my fortune. I'm not fool enough to think fate marked me for any kind of special purpose. We make what we are from whatever materials we are given. I quit school in the 3rd grade and monarchs and rulers still line up to shake my hand. I've been to every country in the world and they call me champion in all their languages. Listen, a pachyderm is still a pachyderm whether in an African plain or in a zoo in Chicago. It's not fate, it's just who we are. I'm a prize fighter and my fists got me here, the best fist a man ever balled up. Thanks to these fists, I've witnessed scenes that poets can't put words to. And thanks to these fists, I'll be the last on my feet. So this is a double spread of the fight itself. So all of this is leading up to the 1910 Battle of the Century, and there's a poem in the Big Smoke about it that goes through round by round. And we decided that it would be a good frame for the graphic novel so we could go back and forth in time and talk about Jack Johnson's life in a way that isn't exactly linear, but there's at least, you know there are rounds to a fight, so we go through his life in that way. And Yusef loved drawing these pages with all these small details, but they take a very long time. This isn't attached to anything, it's just one of my favorite pages of the book. There's Jim Jeffries, the guy Jack Johnson fought, had a trainer named Jim Corbett. There's a lot of Jims in this book. And Jim Corbett was like the most racist of all of them. And so the scene right before this is Jim Corbett yelling things at Jack Johnson from the ringside and telling him that he should he should get out of America, he should swim back to Africa, this kind of really vile stuff. And what Jack Johnson says is, what this guy doesn't know is I'm a modern black man. And then this is the next page, I'm the newest fashion. And so Yusef had this idea of dressing him in traditional African garb from across the continent. And I just think it turned out really beautifully. I'm the newest fashion. And then this is the next page, it was a poem. Africa. I'm a full-blooded American of the first rate. I'm from Galveston, Texas, right by the ocean in the heart of this great land. I can swim, sure, but I've never seen Africa. And when I do, it will be on a first-class steamer, not in my swimming costume. And then Yusuf had this idea of putting the fight and moving it to the stereotype of what people at the time would represent Africans as. This is one of the gifts of working with somebody who was an African illustrator. He had a whole different idea about it than I did. Here's one more poem. So they called the color line the thing that white fighters would use as an excuse to not fight the black fighters. And so Jack Johnson talked a little bit about it. Imagine being the best at what you do and the folks in your profession won't allow you to ply your trade. You might be the best carpenter in New York State and nobody will hire you to pick up a hammer. You might be the finest surgeon in the entire United States, but nobody will let you operate. That's what it was like for me. I was the best to ever put on gloves and none of the white prize fighters would give me a shot at the prize. This is the kind of stuff I couldn't do in the book of poems because he wouldn't have a reason to say this in that book. But in this book, with the art next to it, I could do different things. I'm just going to show a couple more. So the white fighters that they brought out, and this was basically Jack London, Call of the Wild, if people still read that book. He was the one who put out a call for the Great White Hope, some white fighter to come back and take the heavyweight champion back from Jack Johnson. And so this is a little bit about that, and that's going to be the end of the presentation. I took the heavyweight championship from Tommy Burns and nobody was taking it from me. Not President Roosevelt or Tex Rickard or the Great White Hopes. There were so many of them. George Rodell's chin was so weak they called him the Diving Venus. And all those giants, Fred Fulton, the giant of the North, Gunboat Smith, Jim Coffey, the Irish giant, Carl Moses, the Sapaloosa giant. They tried and they all got dropped just like cherries from a tree. Jim Jeffries couldn't have stayed with me in the ring before retirement. What did he hope to do in the ring with me other than bleed? There's only one real giant, Jack Johnson, the Galveston giant. Yeah, I think I'll stop there with this. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Yeah, so what kind of questions do you have about this?
If you all have questions, please sign either to myself or Heather, and we'll come get the mic to you. So who's going to be the first one?
It's always got to be one person to start it off.
I'm Christian Powell. How did you come across Jack Johnson? How did you come to the process of finding out about him or learning about him, deciding to write poetry about him?
Yeah, thank you, Christian. I appreciate that. So Jack Johnson, actually, I learned about Jack Johnson from my mother. And so she was a big fight fan. She loved boxing. And we would watch it together back when it was on regular TV. So it's not like now, if you try to watch a fight, it's like you have to stay up till 11 o'clock and pay $79, and there's some bad fight before the one you want to watch. And it's just not worth it to be a fan sometimes. But in the old days, it used to be on Saturday afternoon. So I'd sit there with my mom and watch Muhammad Ali and Ken Norton, all these great heavyweights of the 70s. And she would bring up Jack Johnson all the time. She never told me who he was. She just would, she used him kind of, I don't know what, if she was cheering for somebody and they lost, she would say a different version of, F that guy, he's no Jack Johnson. When she was cheering for the person, and it turned out later, I found out she was betting on fights, and that was a whole other conversation I had to have with my mom. But, you know, so she introduced it to me, and I wanted to write an essay about what it's like to learn about boxing in a non-traditional way. Like, it wasn't my dad and me sitting there and my dad being like, okay, let's be macho and watch. It was my mom. You know, so it was against all of the sort of stereotypes at the time. And she still loves boxing, and she's decided that this is her favorite book, because she knows it only exists because of us watching those fights when I was a kid. So thanks for that, and thanks for being the first person to ask a question.
Hey, my name is Tessa. And my question would be, when you're writing from the point of view of the character, how do you, or what would your advice be for maintaining the historical language, the voice of the character, and also your voice as the author?
That's a really wonderful question. So there's not really any room in the conversation for me. I think when you're working in a persona, if you're working historically, that has to take precedent. And I'm saying this I'm saying this because I tried. And so when I was working on the book originally, there were a lot of poems where I'd want Jack Johnson to say something that he wouldn't say. Like, there's a lot of domestic violence in the book, and I wanted him to apologize for that. He would have never done any of that because he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. And so for me to bring a 21st century version where I'm like, come on, man, apologize for what you're doing, made bad poems. And so I as early on realized that in persona, when you're writing in a character, anything like that, there are things you can choose, like where they're talking, who they're talking with, that kind of thing, but you can't choose what they would say. Like you've got to be authentic to that. And so I mentioned this earlier, but one of the things I started doing was making questions, like an interview that I wanted Jack Johnson to respond to those interview questions. And that helped guide me a little bit more, so I wasn't just kind of going off-road all the time. I could just say, well, this is important. When did you start boxing? This is important. How did you feel when your wife killed herself? Like things like that I could try to get an authentic answer to that wasn't me trying to answer it for him, but rather having him do the work. Yeah, of course.
Did you, in the efforts of doing that, did you often find yourself getting lost in his character?
You know what I did? And somebody earlier asked about writer's block, and I don't really get it, not because I'm special, but because I always have a lot of different projects at work. And part of the reason I never got lost was because I had 2 other books I was working on at the same time. And so if I got too deep into 1900s and I needed a break, I would just go work on a different book. And I could feel myself doing that sometimes, where I was like, all right, I've been writing this. I've been thinking about automobiles instead of cars. I've been thinking about gum shields instead of, mouthpieces, like thinking in the language of the time in a way that was starting to become problematic for the other poems that I was writing. I would just take a break and let that settle for a little while. It's a really good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
Hi, my name is Gabrielle. At the earlier session, you mentioned the women in Jack Johnson's lives and the erasing or lack of documentation about them. Although you said it's not your story or story to tell, how did you work around the lack of resources when writing in their voice?
Yeah, it was really hard because I wanted to be honest about their lives. Because these are people who existed, I didn't ever want to be making things up about them, and I kind of had the choice to either try to find a way to imagine these experiences or just leave it out and then participate in that erasure. And I didn't want to do that. So I leaned on form to try to figure out a way to give them their own kind of life inside the book. So you have Belle, who writes letters to one of the other women. You got Hattie, Hattie who writes the letters. You've got Belle, who's being interviewed by the Department of Justice, and Etta, who's all of her poems are broken sonnets. And so I wanted each of them, after you figure it out, to just be able to look, oh, here's an interview. Nobody else in the book gets interviewed but Belle. So now she's got a space that maybe is a little bit more hers instead of just being stuck with Jack Johnson. I think later on, it was after I wrote the book that I heard that idea of the Bechdel test where women characters are being received not in proximity to men but as their own. And so I think I was trying to do something like that, but it's hard because it's a book about Jack Johnson. So how do I separate them? And I thought giving them their own kinds of poems might be the way to do it. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, my name is Brianna. In your book, The Big Smoke, with the poem titled Mouth Fighting, who is you referring to as sportswomen?
I'm sorry,
Who is you referring to as sportswomen?
Oh, sporting women? Yeah. Thank you for asking that. So he's talking about sporting women. He's talking about sex workers and people who like the kind of women who would be in the orbit of these gamblers in sports. A lot of them were prostitutes. Jack Johnson's girlfriends, both of them were. His wife Etta was not, but Hattie and Belle both, he found them in brothels. Like he got with them in there. And Belle especially was a big deal because it was a thing in Chicago where black people weren't supposed to be in the building, but he was Jack Johnson, so he got in and then went in and got one of the women working there to leave with him. And so, yeah, they called them sporting women. And so that was the community he was running with. Yeah. That comes up a couple of times in different poems too, so that's it. The sports were the gamblers, the guys who were doing this stuff, and the sporting women were their sort of companions in that lifestyle. Thank you for asking that.
When the play The Great White Hope came out, I remember Muhammad Ali making the statement that you could have changed the names and the dates and it would be my story. In your research, how much of an influence, not so much on his fighting skills, but on his public persona, do you think Jack Johnson was on Muhammad Ali?
That's a really wonderful question. We actually had, I guess I don't have a copy of it to show you, but the graphic originally had a dust jacket on it, but it didn't sit right, so they took it off. On the dust jacket, it was a quote from Muhammad Ali about Jack Johnson, and he, essentially, he said, people think I'm crazy, but Jack Johnson was crazy. Like he's running around in these fast cars with these white women, and there's nobody to protect him. People are getting murdered every day out there, and he's acting this way. It's a marvel that he survived. And so that was like the blurb on the back of the book. It wasn't from other writers, it was from Muhammad Ali. But he talked quite a bit about how close he was. And it's funny because The Great White Hope it's taken parts of Jack Johnson's life out of it, but a lot of it's inaccurate. And so Jack Johnson's buried in Chicago at Graceland Cemetery with the guy who Otis from Otis Elevators, like the guy who created Pullman cars for trains. It's like all these turn of the century captains of industry in Jack Johnson in Graceland. And after that play came out and it came to Chicago, some of the actors went to Jack Johnson's grave and tried to change his gravestone from this one that just says Johnson to one that said Lil Arthur, which was a name he hated that these sports writers gave him. And they knew so little about the guy's life that they were in a play about that they thought it would be a good thing to change his gravestone, right? And so I can't think of the man's name who wrote it right now. It'll come back to me, but he won a Pulitzer Prize for that play. That's like this erroneous version of Jack Johnson's life, and it intersects with Muhammad Ali's life too, minus the white wife. And so there's a lot there. There was a whole lot. His name was Howard Sackler. That's the author of the play. And James Earl Jones played I think his name's Jack Jefferson or something in the movie. He was great. Jane Alexander was great. It's just the facts don't add up. Yeah. Thank you for that. Other questions?
While you were researching to make this book, how did you sort of get to a place where you'd be confident saying, okay, this is something Jack Johnson would say? Like, how did you get a good enough picture of him in your mind to write for him?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Because it goes a little bit back to the question about the women. Like, I never had a good vision of that. Like, I was trying to be consistent, trying to figure out a way to honor their stuff. But with Jack Johnson, there's a lot of text out there. Like, he's got 2 autobiographies, but they were ghostwritten in French and translated into English. There are tons of interviews in newspapers that were a little bit shady, but there's also audio recordings of him and things like that. So I had a lot of material to work from, where I felt like if I could approximate the sentence structure, I'd be able to figure some things out. So I also helped myself by quoting him a lot inside of the poems. Almost every poem has some fragments of language that are from him. The only place that's not true are the shadow poems and the shadow boxing poems. Totally made up. That's all me trying to figure out how to balance out the book. But with him, there are bits and pieces of factual text all over the place. Yeah, thanks for that.
During your research on Jack Johnson's life, when or how did you separate what was written about him to like slander him to what is the truth?
Yeah, that was really hard. Thanks for asking that. So some of it was just the language itself, where he'd be like, "I shows is happy to be," like this, like kind of just vernacular that wasn't his, and it would be in the Chicago Tribune or something like that. And so I just look at that and be like, okay, this isn't somebody who's going to be giving me any information. The flip of that is Jack Johnson's autobiographies, where he sounds like a literature professor, and it's not that either. There was a thing that was in between the two, where this man was very smart, but he's quit school in 3rd grade. So like, it's not a thing where he's going to be referencing stuff that's going to be outside of the wheelhouse of those writers and poets that he was interested in, Rudyard Kipling and Shakespeare and people like that. So if I started seeing things that just seemed out of line with the kind of triangulation I was doing, I just kind of ignored most of that. And also Jack Johnson he didn't lie exactly. He was just a big storyteller. He was a fabulist. And so he would tell these stories that were impossible. But people would believe him because he was so much bigger in life. Like, here's this, enormous man with gold teeth who's better than anybody at this sport that everybody cared about at that time. He used to tell people that when he was 12 years old, he got in a fight with a 25-foot-long shark. And people would believe him. They were like, well, I guess it's possible. It's Jack Johnson, maybe. And he had all these kind of stories about like things that just were utterly impossible. So I think there was the language piece. And then there was the other part of it where he's saying he did this. He said he was a spy in World War I for the U.S. government, like all of this stuff, where it's like, all right, now, you weren't a spy. They were trying to put you in jail. But it turned out that he actually was for like 2 weeks. So he didn't spy much of anything, but they paid for him having some nights out on the town while he pretended to be looking for this German submarine base. And then they figured out that he wasn't really doing much of anything for him. But that's the thing about this guy. He was so weird and funny, and also a man of his time, which makes him not, in some ways, not the most gentlemanly, even as he was trying to be a gentleman. So, yeah. What questions you got? Oh.
Hi. So I don't know if it's just me, but I've never heard of Jack Johnson until I read the book, which I thought was really weird because wasn't he alive like during the same time as Booker T. Washington?
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
He was. So he. It's in. I just realized I almost got the two books mixed up. I wrote some stuff about Booker T. Washington in the book, but I had a whole poem about Booker T. Washington I took out because it didn't work. But there's a scene in the graphic novel where Booker T. Washington and Du Bois are debating Jack Johnson, while Jack Johnson's sitting in the audience watching them. They're in a boxing ring talking about him. Booker T. Washington hated Jack Johnson. Absolutely hated him because he's everything. For those who know about Booker T's idea of casting your buckets down and everything, there was nothing humble about this person at all. And it would have been the opposite of what Booker T. Washington believed we should be as recently emancipated people, right? Du Bois didn't really care one way or another. He just felt like if you can do it, you should do it. You shouldn't start from the bottom just because you're black. And, so that humility that Booker T. Washington was invested in didn't resonate very well at all with Jack Johnson. So the two of them, they weren't homies. I hadn't really heard about Jack Johnson that much either, except for my mom mentioning him. And, that's coming from somebody I'm pretty deep in boxing history, or I was when I was younger, and still hadn't really heard of him too much. He's a really fascinating figure. But what ended up happening, and it's not in the book, it's not in the Big Smoke, but it's in the graphic, he got convicted of a thing called the Mann Act, which is, well, I guess it's mentioned in the Big Smoke, which is transporting a woman across state lines for the purposes of prostitution. So it goes back to the question about sporting women, right? So Belle was a prostitute. He took her across state lines on a trip because they were together, and they used that to arrest and convict him of the Mann Act. And also because she turned state's evidence on him, too. Long story, but his wife found out, and she told him, if you don't get rid of her, I'm leaving you. So Jack Johnson gave her $500 and a train ticket, and Belle was like, I'm not having that. You don't get rid of me. And so she went and talked to the Department of Justice about him. And to make things worse, Jack Johnson would bring his mistresses with him, and they would pay for their own stuff, and he would tell them to keep receipts and then he'd reimburse them at the end of the trip. So when she goes to the Department of Justice, she has actual receipts saying, I was with him in Reno, I was with him in California, here's the ticket, and just dropped all of that to the government. So it took them 20 minutes to convict the guy, right? So that all goes back to your original question, and that because he was convicted, because he put a stain in a particular way on black athletes, nobody wanted to mess with him. And his story just kind of disappeared, really until the Great White Hope. He was just gone. I met we didn't meet, I corresponded with his great-great-grandniece, and she said that she didn't even know she was related to him until she was in high school. Like, that's how little people wanted to mess with Jack Johnson, because they saw him as a convict. He ran from the U.S. government. He'd done all of these things, and it was a bad look. But in actuality, he got railroaded. Like, all of these things happened that were beyond his control because of his race. And so I hope that in some small ways, this book and the graphic novel in a different way remind us that, it's been institutional injustice from the jump. There was no way that man was going to ever survive. He just didn't know it until it was much too late. Thanks for that question. Do we have time for a couple more? Or is that?
Anybody else? One more? Okay. Thank you, Adrian.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you.
Meet us outside in the lobby for the book signing.